To call to order the Planning Commission meeting of October 28th, 2024. Christina, would you please do the roll call?
Vice Chair Mitchell,
Yeah, present.
Rigby,
Here.
Ginone, Sly,
Here.
and Chair Moreno, Commissioner Rachel Najak, and Xing Chuing are absent today. We do have Councilman Mboop joining us today.
Great, thank you. We'll move on to item 3 from the agenda, council update. Councilman Boop, would you like to give us an update?
Have a lot, but I haven't been here for almost 2. I missed 1 meeting. So the things I have is we proclaimed Indigenous Peoples Day on October 14th, and it's something we celebrate in our city. We talk something that are linked to what you're doing here, like approving some annexing to the city, like some, should I say those? I think you will all know about that, like some people annexing to the city and what is entailed. We did some resolution on annexing to the city, 1 parcel of 0.24 acres at 5077 Down Street, and declaring also City of Lake Oswego zoning of R10 pursuant to LOC 5010004 and removing the territory from certain district. And we also had a resolution granting Portland General Electric for a franchise to operate an electric light and power system, because they were not a franchise like we were renewing the franchise with PGE, and we did it, but by doing it, we add from 3%, I think, to 5%, and the fund will go to a park, I think. It's not parks. The Boone, I think, where does the fund we get from PGE go to? General fund, yeah. So it's around $600,000 it would be per year. So it's something that can help. And we also had very interesting stuff like that Eric might know. I think it's the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program. FEMA, it gets sued by people who, about the Endangered Species Act. And now FEMA is asking all jurisdiction to update, to get their act together, and so that we can be conform. It's I think it's on every building we are doing, we have to do some work on the Endangered Species Act, making sure that the protection is
last meeting, and we'll be adopting findings tonight to refer to the council. So they're familiar with that.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you. And that's, I think, and also we talk about the licensing fee structure in the city of Lake Oswego. I'd like to update it because everybody's paying $100 almost, 102, and some businesses are bigger than others. We decided that we are gonna go from 0 to 25, have a fee, and then from to 100 employees and more have some fees that we are changing. I think that's what I have. We also, of course, our term is up for re-election, and I'm not calling for, just to say that 3 of us and the mayor, we are running unopposed, and On the ballot also, we have something, the council, the commission work about the measure 36118, which is building a roundabout at Stafford Road, and it's in the ballot, and we are asking the citizen to say yes or no. And there is also the psilocybin. We are also asking the citizens to say yes or no. So thank you for your time. If you have questions, most of the questions, Eric and Jessica and Evan would be the best one to respond.
Thank you, Counselor. Appreciate the update. Okay, moving on to item 4 on the agenda, public comment. Christina, does anyone wish to provide public comment for items not on the agenda? Thank you. And item 5, the Commission for Citizen Involvement, general updates. I don't believe we have any this evening, from what I could tell. That brings us to item 6.1, finding conclusions in order with respect to the wastewater treatment plant, LU 24-0030. The draft findings were distributed earlier to the commissioners. Did any of the commissioners have any revisions, comments, or questions to those?
I'd just like to note that I wasn't present for either of those meetings where action was taken on that. So I would plan to abstain from those votes. So I don't know if we would have a quorum in order to pass findings.
We have a quorum to call the meeting, and then the motion must be adopted by a majority of those present. So.
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Rigby. So with no revisions, is there a motion to approve?
I motion that we approve the minutes of the conclusions.
Is there a second?
I second.
Christina, can you take a vote? Guess Commissioner Rigby is going to abstain, so there's 3 of us voting.
Okay. So Mitchell,
Yes.
Sly,
Yes.
and Skinoni,
Yes.
Rigby.
Okay, thank you. And with 3 out of the 4 present, I think that the motion carries and the findings, conclusions in order for wastewater treatment plant LU 24-0030 are approved as written. Moving on to item 6.2, another draft finding conclusions in order. This one is for the Flood Hazard Management Code amendments, LU 24-0037. And the draft findings were distributed earlier to the commissioners. And same question, are there any revisions, comments, or questions to those? Commissioner Rigby, I assume you have the same comment, okay? Okay, and seeing that there's no comments or revisions, is there a motion to approve the findings, conclusions, and orders as drafted?
I move that we approve the code amendments.
Second?
Second.
Put it to a vote?
Mitchell,
Yes.
Rigby,
Abstain.
Skinoni,
Yes.
and Sly.
Yes.
Great. And with 3 yeses and 1 abstention, the motion is approved. Okay, that'll bring us to item number 7 on the agenda, and that is the public hearing. This is with respect to, this public hearing is to consider the proposed amendments to comply with Phase B of the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Parking Rules. I think, Mr. Boone, you state the meeting procedure?
I'd be happy to, Mr. Chair. This is a legislative decision, which is generally a policy decision within the discretion of the City Council. The Planning Commission will review the legislative proposal and make a recommendation to the City Council. Although a legislative decision may be discretionary, it must also comply with applicable state law, as well as any applicable statewide planning goal or administrative rule adopted pursuant to ORS Chapter 197. A legislative amendment to the Community Development Code must also comply with any applicable provision of the Lake Oswego Comprehensive Plan. Public hearing process will first begin with a presentation by staff, then testimony will be received from the public. Individuals will be allowed up to 5 minutes. Recognized neighborhood associations, homeowner associations, government or government agencies, or other incorporated public interest organizations will be allowed up to 10 minutes. These time limits do not include time taken by questions from the commission or responses to such questions. Testimony by attorneys, representatives, and witnesses on behalf of which part of the presentation by a person shall be counted within that person's time limit. Any person in attendance may cede his or her time for testimony to another person, but in no case shall any person's testimony be increased to greater than 10 minutes. At this point, I would ask the commission members if you need to declare any financial conflicts of interest. Hearing none, long-range planner Eric Olson with the staff report.
All right. Thank you, Deputy City Attorney Boone. And yes, as was mentioned, we're here tonight to talk about code amendments and comprehensive plan amendments that have been proposed for compliance with the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules established by the state of Oregon. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Talk a little bit about just what we're going to go through in general. Of course, we've talked about this several times at the Planning Commission, so I'm not going to go into too much background, but I do, just because this is kind of a milestone of a certain type, I will go over a few things related to that background. Talk a little bit about what the city has done in response to those rules, and then I'll talk about the draft code and comprehensive plan amendments. And I'll be sure to point out some of the changes we've recently proposed in response to comments that were received from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. We did receive comments on October 15th, an email from Ryan Markart at DLCD, and they pointed out a number of issues that they had identified in terms of our compliance with the state rules, and we have issued some changes that were outlined in a supplemental staff memo last Friday in response to those comments. So I will be sure to point those out along the way, as opposed to kind of just overloading you with that right now. And then when I finish, I will talk about kind of next steps with the project, or when I'm close to finishing, rather. So, all right, I will get going here. And just, I guess, to be formal about it, we did receive comments from DLCDs. You can find those in the, those were emailed to you as Exhibit F1, dated October 15th, 2024. So a bit of background about these rules. Again, I'll try to not spend too incredibly much time here, but just to sort of go over what the program is intended to do here. Again, this is, climate-friendly and equitable communities is a bit of a handful, or a mouthful rather, so I will try to shorten it to CFEC, as unpleasant as that might be as of an abbreviation to hear. But this was originally passed by former Governor Kate Brown through Executive Order 20-04. The intent is really to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by directing development into mixed-use centers and areas with transit, making walking, cycling, and transit safer and more convenient, and providing folks with access to services and destinations. We have a lot of the provisions that were asked to be implemented for states throughout the region already implemented here in Lake Oswego, so a lot of that applies primarily to smaller cities that were forced to do sort of town center planning for the first time throughout this exercise. Specifically with respect to the city of Lake Oswego, the parking provisions are really the biggest change that this will require. So really, there is a focus on parking here. The idea is that more parking really leads to more driving and more greenhouse gas emissions. And I will just kind of review a bit of what we heard from a representative from the State Department of Land Conservation and Development, who came and discussed this with the Planning Commission as well as City Council last year. So just a reminder of kind of what they had mentioned at that time. The idea is that the market-based approach would really be driven by supply and demand, as opposed to sort of outdated parking requirements. So their simple idea is that just because we're not mandating parking, it does not mean that parking will be that won't be provided. So there are several examples of this, but we have two from Corvallis and Eugene here, and some pretty active areas of the city that ended up building more parking than required, even in the lack of, even when there was no mandate, as in Eugene. Also, they've pointed out that parking uses a lot of land. You can see that, a two-bedroom apartment is approximately, 3 parking spaces or so. So you're really just kind of sacrificing land for housing. And, that can be at the, great expense to the developer as well. So their point was that most cities have a parking management problem, not necessarily a supply shortage. And we found that in the city of Lake Oswego as well. So parking can be a significant expense in displaced housing. So there are several examples here of that. I won't go into too much detail, but you can see that depending on whether or not it's a parking garage or surface parking, prices per off-street spot can range between $1,500 for a surface parking spot at the minimum to up to $62,000 for a garage spot, and that's kind of the maximum. So just kind of an idea there, and also you can see from some studies in King County, Washington, that leasing costs actually increase by 12.5% to 25%, depending on how much parking is required. So really there is a relationship between parking requirements and affordable housing. Also, we found that many parking spots are underused, ranging between 25% to 40%, depending on the location. Of course, that's fairly context specific, but this generally holds true in a lot of different areas, including Lake Oswego. So just to provide an overview of the rules, again, we've talked quite a bit about this, but the first requirement was something that the city had to adopt by the end of the year of 2022. So we were required to implement Phase A of the parking provisions by that point, which essentially just applied within a 1/2 mile boundary of bus line 35. So you've probably seen that map that shows bus line 35, really just looking at a huge swath of the east side of the city, covering First Edition, Old Town, Glen Marie, a number of different neighborhoods where we have not been enforcing parking requirements pursuant to state law since the end of 2022, early 2023. So it's been about a 1.5 years now that we've complied with that, and per state law, are not enforcing the parking mandates of any type in that area. With respect to the second requirement related to electric vehicle charging, we were able to start implementing provisions here at the city in March of 2023 to require that 40% of spaces provided within a development essentially have, and this applies to mixed use and multifamily residential, that 40% of parking spaces, generally speaking, in those developments would have to have electric vehicle conduit, not necessarily the charging stations themselves, but just the conduit. So that's something that we implemented back in 2023 when we were required to do so. Both of those pieces, the EV charging and the Phase A of the parking, we propose to embed in the code as a part of this proposal. So that's something that we had been doing by just kind of referencing the state law. So the idea is to have a code that says this so that people can actually understand what those regulations are without having to cross-reference too many items at once. Really what we're here, though, to talk about today is the Phase B parking amendments, both to the Comprehensive Plan and Community Development Code, which through an extension provided by the state, we are required to implement by the end of this year, December 31st, 2024. Another piece that I should mention is the TSP update, which we are given direction by the state to start doing in 2029. So that's a little ways off. So now I'll talk a little bit about the city's response to the CFEC rules. There are 3 different sort of options for compliance, and we discussed these in depth with both the Planning Commission and City Council. Options 2 and 3, involve a lot of things that City Council was reticent to explore, including paid on-street parking, potential sort of costs to businesses by requiring them to provide a flexible commute benefit. So that would apply to businesses with 50 or more employees, as well as other kind of complications that would really make parking regulations very difficult to implement and for folks to actually look in the code and understand, with really a very, what we see as a very minimal outcome difference in terms of the parking sort of management issues. Option 1 was the one that we were given ultimately direction to pursue by City Council. That was to repeal all parking mandates within the jurisdiction, and there are no additional sort of complicating factors with that option. So just to kind of really quickly talk through these options, what we have been given direction to pursue was option 1, no mandates. Again, options 2 and 3 had various different sort of cons associated with it that were not associated with option 1, particularly paid on-street parking, potential for sort of pricing parking related to unbundled parking, as well as it would almost be a given that we would have to ask employers of 50 or more people to issue flexible commute benefits for their employees to sort of subsidize the cost of parking for their employees directly. So we saw those, and council saw those as direct sort of impacts to businesses that they wanted to avoid. So really, when we talked about option 1, looking at the pros and cons, we got, again, direction that option 1 was the preferable choice here. Basically, again, for the reasons that I've explained, it's very simple and easy to explain and understand. It's not quite as simple as we might have originally imagined when we first got into this exercise, when we started looking at the parking maximum regulations, but it is by far the simplest option. It had minimal to no additional cost to implement, and low sort of impacts on businesses. Actually would produce more flexibility for businesses to be located in the city, as well as flexibility for allowing different development types on a citywide basis. So we found that it was consistent, and that it consistently sort of eliminated barriers to things that were prioritized by City Council, including promoting development and promoting business sort of location within the city. So that is what we ended up sort of moving with. The idea, again, it's not quite as complicated, or it's not quite as simple as just sort of removing the minimum parking requirements from the code. It was a lot more that was needed, and you can see that in the code amendments themselves. But yeah, there was a unanimous preference at council for that option. Just pointing out, there are a number of other cities that have also implemented option 1, all the cities that I'm aware of that are compliant with CFEC to this point, including Portland, Tigard, Salem, Central Point, Albany, Corvallis, Bend, and Beaverton. That list might be longer by now, but I couldn't find an update. In terms of public engagement, we have talked about this quite a bit with City Council as well, and probably exceeded what was originally expected of us by Council, just because we wanted to cover our bases here. We've been conducting targeted outreach to project stakeholders since October of last year, when we were given initial guidance on this. We've talked at the Lake Oswego Sustainability Network, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Lake Grove Business Committee, the DEI Advisory Board, the Mayor's Roundtable. I believe this was the one in February that we talked about it. And we are scheduled to talk about it at the Neighborhood Chairs Committee on the 16th of November prior to the City Council hearing. We also had a project website with an email list, a lot of general information and FAQs, including a comment form where people could provide their initial sort of responses to the proposal. We've had 4 Planning Commission work sessions and 4 study sessions at Council. We've had articles in the Hello LO, and we did hold a community forum event on July 24th, which was, I believe, right after the last time we discussed this at the Planning Commission. We also have scheduled a presentation for neighborhoods sort of within or adjacent to the Lake Grove Village Center Overlay District, and that is tentatively scheduled for the 20th of November, including those 3 neighborhood associations, Lake Forest, Lake Grove, and Willuga Neighborhood Association. So those are kind of tentatively scheduled, but we are more or less firm on those dates, and don't see, we very much intend for those to happen, I guess, even though they're tentative. Moving on just into our proposal, the draft code amendments, and of course there are comprehensive plan amendments as well. So we have developed draft comprehensive plan and code amendments to comply with the applicable CFEC rules. And of course those are included as exhibits and attachments rather to an exhibit in your package. As I mentioned, parking phase A is kind of covered by the overall removal of parking mandates citywide. So that's something that we are able to comply with through item 24 under the exemption for communities without parking mandates. That's really kind of the big move of removing minimum parking requirements from the code. We are complying with the electric vehicle charging requirements that I mentioned earlier by essentially embedding them in the code, not having them just as an editor's note, which is what they are currently within our code. This is one of the items that we did make a change to. Really, what we did was we added another sentence here to clarify that there is an additional provision with respect to electric vehicle charging. Typically, it can be, in other cities and in our community has been heretofore implemented through the building code, but because it is more or less a restricted development regulation, DLCD indicated that it would be helpful to have it within our code itself. So we made an amendment to item 39 in the most recently issued supplemental staff memo to basically clarify that commercial buildings, this also applies to commercial buildings under private ownership, and that they basically have to serve 20% of vehicle parking spaces that they're being provided on their site with that EV capacity, just the conduit capacity, not necessarily the chargers again. So just to clarify that in addition to the 40% that's applicable to mixed use and multifamily buildings, there is a 20% regulation applicable to privately owned commercial buildings. That's really the change there. Just kind of putting it all in one place for ease of reference. As I mentioned, we did, through item 24, make a big move to remove parking requirements from the code. We did a number of other things with the code in parking regulation improvements, or to respond to rules related to parking regulation improvements and parking maximums and evaluation in more populous communities, and I will talk about those in the next several slides. So in terms of parking regulation improvements, we have added, basically, we've removed a reference to required parking within the section of the code that already kind of requires preferential placement of carpool and van pool parking. So we didn't really have to do much to comply there, but we did clean it up a bit. Item 38, we also basically went forward to make an amendment to make sure that we complied with this rule through item 38, but we're going to allow redevelopment of any portion of a parking lot for bike or transit uses. So while we do have some existing provisions that would allow it for transit uses, we had to amend the code to allow it for bike facilities as well, through item 38. With respect to other parking regulation improvements, basically there were two pieces here that our initial assessment was, we were going to be in compliance with these based on DLCD guidance. For the most part, when it comes to the development code, we're doing what we need to do within our code. However, per the comment letter from DLCD, further policy action is needed in order to establish a policy within the city to encourage the redevelopment of underused parking spaces for things like parklets, bike parking, or, I forget the specific term that they use, but for large bike parking facilities, or for green infrastructure like bioswales or storm drainage facilities, that would be green. So I think that is something that we as a city do. We don't necessarily have a policy that says we encourage you to take underused parking spaces and use it for this reason. However, that is something that we have done in places like D Avenue and 10th Street here within the city. So, we're going to have to follow up on this, but essentially the current package doesn't address this particular rule in terms of the policy, so there will be further action needed in order for us to comply there. All right, and so I think another large thing that I wanted to point out that we've talked about previously, but we are implementing new rules for surface parking lots over a ½ acre in size as a part of these requirements. Essentially the regulations from the state required us to do this for these larger surface parking lots, to require them to provide a climate mitigation action as was deemed within the state rules. But they defined that as being essentially some combination of providing on-site solar panels, paying into a renewable energy fund, or providing 40% tree canopy coverage. So we had talked to you about this at the last work session here at the Planning Commission, and we were provided with guidance to basically keep these as options. There was a bit of a discussion about this, but there was essentially the ultimate sort of takeaway that we got was to keep all three options and allow them to use the different options for compliance here, even if potentially tree canopy might be the easier one to comply with. So again, we got some comments from the Department of Land Conservation and Development related to sort of which developments this regulation applies to, which ones, which surface parking lots would have to comply with these rules. So we added an amendment to item 28 to really clarify that The section applies to all private developments and some public agency development, except those that are required to comply with OAR 331.35.0020. Basically, there are some exemptions for public agency developments, but not all public agency developments are exempted from those requirements. So really just wanted to reference that there are some exemptions while still getting it right. And we should not be exempting all public agency developments per DLCD's guidance. That's what the revised code amendment should reflect. Other things that we implemented here are to require, regardless of kind of the option is selected, regardless of the climate mitigation action that is selected for the surface parking lot, that there is still a minimum of a 30% tree canopy coverage required, or that parking lot is required to provide trees along driveways. So there's somewhat of a tree canopy requirement regardless of the climate mitigation action selected. We also, in order to comply with the state law, are requiring new surface parking lots of this size to provide pedestrian connections throughout the parking lot, connecting building entrances with a variety of different transit and pedestrian-related infrastructure, as well as accessible parking spaces. Item 32 is also included, and that requires coordination with the local electric utility when applicants are coming up with these tree canopy plans to fulfill the requirements of this section. We also had originally sort of required applicants to follow specified tree planting standards to fulfill these tree canopy requirements, and that's what we received a comment on from DLCD. They had noted that while what we had proposed originally was more or less in line with the intent of the standard, it might not be considered to be clear and objective the way that it was worded previously. So we went through and we did our best to make this clear and objective through a reference to the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, A300 planting standards, which appear to be the sort of industry standard when it comes to tree planting requirements and are considered to be a clear and objective document per DLCD. So that's how we propose to sort of clear and objectify our tree planting standards related to this particular standard. All right, a lot of the remaining amendments I'll be talking about relate to maximum parking requirements in the city, and I'll just give a really brief overview of what the current parking maximums are in our code. Again, we've talked about this recently, but I just wanted to kind of reiterate this for the record, I suppose. But the city's current maximum parking regulations were originally adopted in 1996 to comply with Metro's regional parking policy. What we did was we had the maximum amount of parking spaces that were allowed set at the minimum number of spaces required. So 125% of what was previously the minimum parking requirement was our maximum parking requirement. So I'd point that out. I used to reference the sort of minimum number of spaces. Because we're no longer going to have those in the code, we need to come up with something a bit different for the proposed code amendments. So you'll see that that is something we've proposed in these code amendments. And yeah, I guess I would also point out that we are introducing maximum parking requirements through these code amendments for the first time for certain uses in the city, particularly for multifamily residential. Currently, there are no maximum parking requirements for multifamily residential uses in the city, and we will be required to implement those through compliance with this. So I will talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. All right, so really, in order to comply with these parking maximums, we had to look at both Metro and DLCD regulations. So I'll talk a little bit about DLCD's regulations with respect to CFEC that we were responding to here. They wanted us to apply parking maximums just within certain areas. So they're kind of the more targeted areas, the Downtown Redevelopment Design Overlay District and the Lake Grove Village Center Overlay District, which are considered our town centers for the purpose of Metro's 2040 growth plan, as well as properties located within a half mile of TriMet Bus Line 35, as I mentioned before. So the area really on the east side of the city where we're already not implementing parking mandates is kind of where this applies. But because the CFEC rules are limited to those areas for the parking maximum discussion, we have developed sort of different areas of the city for the purposes of implementing parking maximums. Really, all the areas covered by CFEC are supposed to be within parking area A, and parking area B encompasses all the rest of the city. We recently, again, made some changes related to this in response to some comments from DLCD. Really what we did is just added direct links to maps that depict the geographies where Area A is just basically depicting the boundaries of Area A. So we have those directly in the table now as table notes so that folks can see that, can click on those links, but can also see within the table itself, an actual, the map that you see right here that kind of shows, which areas are Area A and which areas are Area B. Assuming that folks don't have, extremely good eyesight, we thought that they might want to see a little bit more enlarged versions of those maps. So we have included links to those as well. And as I mentioned, in addition to the state rules, we are also required to comply with Metro's parking maximums, which, even though we originally had developed parking maximums to comply with Metro regulations, we were a little bit out of date in terms of our compliance with the current regulations. So we had to also make some proposals to comply with the Metro parking maximums. Luckily, the Metro also applies the parking maximum ratios to the same type of geographies that are covered by CFAC. So when we talk about parking Area A on this map, that's very similar and basically exactly the same as what is referred to as Zone A by Metro. So we were lucky that that allowed us to simplify things a bit for the purpose of making our own compliant regulations, but more or less, Zone A and Zone B are similar. Metro's Zone A and Zone B are similar to parking Area A and parking Area B within the city of Lake Oswego. So, as you might expect, we were required to comply with the more restrictive of these two regulations. So that required a lot of sort of crosswalking of regulations and looking into just trying to really unpack what those were for the different for CFAC, for Metro, and what we currently have, and looking at what we're proposing. So there was a lot of tables and research done that we talked about over the summer related to that. All right, so what we propose in terms of parking maximums for residential uses in order to comply with, and this is in order to comply with CFAC specifically, really we had to decrease the maximum parking that would be permitted for multifamily residential in parking Area A. So while we used to have no maximums for parking in parking Area A, because of CFAC, we are required to allow only 1.2 spaces per studio unit and a maximum of 1.2 spaces per studio unit and a maximum of 2 spaces per non-studio residential unit, basically 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and up. So that's what we've proposed. Just pointing out that detached single-family dwellings, middle housing, and multifamily residential uses located elsewhere in the city outside of parking Area A, so within Area B, there would continue to be no maximum parking. So really only the maximum multifamily parking requirements are within that Area A. For commercial uses, a lot of these are applicable within Area A, but they affect the rest of the city as well. So really we had to make sure that all commercial and retail uses had maximum parking regulations that were no higher than 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of floor space. There are some exceptions here: automobile sales and repair, eating and drinking establishments, and entertainment and commercial recreation uses. But basically, in order to accomplish sort of compliance with this part of the CFAC code, we were required to decrease just really a very small amount from 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet plus sort of set percentage of spaces per station for these barbershops, beauty salons, and personal care services. We just kind of reduced that to just 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet without that additional requirement for a number of spaces per station at the nail salon. So really, just because of CFAC, a pretty small change here to the commercial parking maximums, but in order to comply with that Metro table that I had recently pointed out, this sort of Metro table 3.083, we have also had to make a little bit more substantive of a change to the maximum parking permitted for office uses. So now there's a parking maximum of 3.4 spaces per 1,000 square feet for office uses in parking Area A and 4.1 spaces per 1,000 square feet in Area B. So that is, probably the biggest change, I guess, would be to the multifamily residential use and the office uses, there would be a decrease to the maximum parking. So, a few other things that I'd point out, extremely large buildings, so buildings with more than 65,000 square feet of floor area are not permitted to provide more surface parking than the floor area of the building. That is also something that we have implemented through item 20 within the code amendments. We also, per one of the OARs, are not allowed to apply maximum parking to non-surface parking, like tuck under parking, underground, subsurface parking, and parking structures. All of those are exempted from maximum parking regulations, so that is also outlined within item 20 in the code amendments. There are other things that we had to exclude in order to comply with these regulations. That, we had to exclude a few things from maximum parking regulations, including fleet parking, vehicle parking for sale, lease, or rent, employee carpool and van pool parking, and parking provided under the ADA. So those are some sort of wrinkles to the parking maximum regulations here. Really, for all other commercial uses, we are proposing to increase the maximum number of spaces that are permitted for those uses to the fullest extent that we could while still complying with CFAC and Metro requirements. And you can see that in item 21, really, that amended parking maximum table will show you all of the different sort of new requirements. We've attempted to streamline and align those as much as we possibly could. So again, really want to provide a little bit more flexibility within the sort of parameters that were established by Metro and the state. So sort of modest to significant increases to the maximum number of spaces permitted for a long list of commercial uses. I don't want to get into reading this entire list, but you can see that this has a more breadth of impact than some of the reductions to the parking maximums. All right, so that kind of really talks about I'm trying to cover the big moves in the code amendments and the comprehensive plan amendments. A lot of, what we did with the comprehensive plan amendments are removing references to minimum parking requirements. And we had to do that elsewhere in the code. So just to be consistent, we could no longer continue to reference things that would not exist. So I would mention that was a fairly big piece of the code amendments and comprehensive plan amendments too. It's just kind of that cleanup piece. In terms of next steps, though, obviously we're here at a fairly significant milestone date for the project, the Planning Commission hearing on October 28th today. If all goes according to plan, we will be bringing this to council on December 3rd for a hearing, and they would be adopting the code and comprehensive plan amendments, the findings, on December 17th. So another step, of course, that I did not include here would be to adopt the findings, conclusions in order at the Planning Commission on November 13th. So that would be the next step for the Planning Commission, but the bigger date is that December 3rd public hearing. And with that, I will pause and conclude my presentation and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Questions?
I have a kind of a curiosity question. So as we make all these little amendments to the compliance codes, which is good, who checks all of this? So we just do this and then we send it off to Salem and they just say, okay? Or is someone of your level going through and say, oh, wait a minute, no, you kind of bent the rules too much. So I guess the question is, maybe it's probably the wrong kind of question to ask, but how much can you bend the rules to maybe make things easier without causing issues? So it just seems there's so much information in here. Is someone really going through and reading all this just to make sure Lake Oswego is up to code?
Well, you obviously saw that there were comments submitted by a representative from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So that is essentially the check on the city. And whenever we propose a community development code amendment or a comprehensive plan amendment, it needs to be sent to the state through what they call a post-amendment. Anyway, there's an approval process at the state as well, particularly for the housing production strategy. They have their own actual sort of review period. But when it comes to this, they are actively involved with providing comments and reviewing applications and letting us know in advance, preferably, which is what they did, whether or not we comply and whether what we propose complies. So that's kind of why we release the code amendments so far in advance of the hearing. We're not required to release them 35 days in advance of the hearing. We actually had developed code amendments back, before our last Planning Commission work session. So we've had these kind of going for a while and have been communicating with them, with DLCD about these code amendments for a little bit. So, obviously they were in here to talk about it and give us a little bit of a presentation last year too. So they have their ears on the ground and are, paying attention to what's happening in cities throughout the state, including ours. There might be people that have a little bit more attention to the city of Lake Oswego just for, its sort of high profile nature and being an affluent city. But, for the most part, that happens to every city. So I think, when it comes to your question as to, whether or not we can bend these rules, I think you kind of see that play out in their comments. There was one small piece related to a policy proposal that we did not, move on, that they pointed out, and they were actively looking for that and sort of had flagged that. And now that's something we're gonna have to follow up on. So they are paying attention to those close details and seem to be, understanding, but not, going to let things slide necessarily.
Okay, no, that's,
I guess the lawyer would say, we don't bend the rules, we comply with the rules. Now, you don't have to do so with DLCD with the specific verbatim language that they necessarily give us. In fact, we did, and that wasn't compliant with the clear and objective standards. So, but we do have to comply with the standards, or there's a process which they would then challenge the adoption on that item.
thank you.
I have a question, Mr. Olson, and apologies, I don't specifically recall discussing in one of our various work sessions, but if this is passed and parking minimums mandates are completely removed, I get going forward, all new development, we're leaving it up to the market, supply and demand. The developer gets to decide to put how much they want to put, subject now to the maximums that we've learned about. But for existing developed land that was built with parking that had to comply with the prior minimums, would current landowners then, they're not sort of grandfathered in now, they can decide, I don't need 75 spots anymore because those parking mandates have been removed, and sort of they can figure out what to do with unused parking spaces?
That is accurate, yeah. And I just, in a general sense, the sort of excess of parking would be, non-conforming moving forward, and that doesn't mean that we would necessarily be required to take any action for existing developments. However, if there was a new development, if they were to sort of tear up that parking lot and build a new parking lot, we would have to start applying the new parking maximum regulations. So that's kind of the standard, the example that DLCD has used is when that parking lot starts to get dug up and there's sort of a new, surface parking or a new structure of parking being proposed. That's when they would consider it a new parking surface or structure. Just repainting lines isn't something that would apply here. And also we have policies that promote the reuse of existing parking spaces. So in the specific example you're talking about, that's something that is encouraged by the CDC regulations or amendments that we're proposing, directly sort of promote that use to try to take those underused spots and turn them into something else. So it's encouraged, it's not required, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I would also add that if a development had a prior land use approval that required a certain number of parking spaces, that land use approval still stands unless they come in and modify it. So for instance, the North Anchor project, the city's project, they came in and did a modification to their parking. Now, they still provided parking. They didn't have to, they still did, but they did modify some of their parking for that project. And we've had inquiries from other businesses saying, hey, if this gets passed, can we come in and modify our land use application? And the answer is yes.
I was looking at the discussion on the changes related to the public agency development parking requirements or lack thereof. And I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding it. The reason that there's an exemption for public agency developments only because they are exempt in some cases from the state requirements?
Yeah, there's an exemption. There's basically different rules that apply to public agency developments that meet, this OAR, and I don't remember the exact OAR off the top of my head. But yeah, there are exemptions for some public agency developments that wouldn't need to comply with these maximum park, or the sort of surface parking climate mitigation action type of regulations, but would be subject to their own regulations through that OAR.
Yeah, I would emphasize certain public agencies, in certain ones, so it's not all that we had that issue with DLCD, are required to comply with essentially more strict standards on green energy requirements. And so rather than double dip, there's an exception in the administrative rule regarding the large parking lot, half acre. Certain public agencies are required to do more in terms of meeting climate effects than these rules are. So they didn't require them to do both.
Okay, thank you. That's good to hear. I was feeling a little bit like, if these rules are meant to, address important concerns, and it's interesting that, public agencies, well, I guess it doesn't count if it's one of their parking lots, but that
Yeah, the
sounds
exemption
above
is
board.
a little bit misleading in that they're exempted from these requirements, but there are other more stringent requirements that would apply.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Okay, I think we'll move on to public testimony. Christina, has anyone signed up to testify either in person or virtually?
I have Deborah Linke.
Tonight.
Welcome, thank you for coming.
Well, as you know, my name is Deborah Link, and I'm a resident of First Edition. Prior to living in Lake Oswego, we also lived in a forested area in Colorado, and I had the experience as a Red Cross volunteer to see firsthand the devastation limited ingress and egress had during the major fires in the state. I noted at the time we moved that Lake Oswego had adequate on-site parking generally in the residential areas and for businesses, which would allow emergency vehicles to pass and access the area. As I read the changes that are being proposed in the development code, I am very concerned on multiple levels about safety in my neighborhood. I'll give you specific current examples that I'm concerned about. There's an 8-unit cottage cluster, which is currently in the permitting process at 233 East Street. The lot is 0.26 acres, and the developer is not proposing any parking. Directly across the street from there, there's a full block of another cluster of about 10 homes at 310G and 804 and 816 3rd, with only 5 parking spots in the original proposal. It is disingenuous to believe that these 18 homes will have no vehicles. There will be, I'm guessing, at least 18 and probably 36 or more vehicles in that very small area. By training, I'm a civil engineer. The streets in the area are very narrow, and when cars are parked around the exterior of the new development, say 2 or 3 to a side, the effective street width is narrowed considerably. When there is a car parked on both sides of E and G Street, which border those properties, 2 oncoming cars cannot safely pass, let alone a fire truck. Let me be very, very clear. A fire in Tryon Creek Park can only be accessed through G and F and those surrounding streets. In a wildland fire, we are not talking about 1 or 2 emergency vehicles. We are talking about dozens of fire trucks plus heavy equipment in order to successfully defend our city. As someone who knows how carefully fire departments consider safety, I am surprised that the issue has not arisen. in the reassessment and revision of the development codes and approval process other than for designated fire lanes around commercial and government buildings? Are we going to leave the residents and their properties to burn? That being said, I believe that the development code should be modified to take into account the safety implications of unplanned parking. It is within the city's purview to exact a parking assessment, just as there is to fund storm drainage. The city can designate and limit times for on-street parking and issue a one-car-per-home permit for street parking in the area, finding and towing vehicles that are non-compliant. Additionally, the city can ration and limit times for on-street parking with fines and consequences for that. There's also the very unpleasant option of denying non-emergency vehicle access on those streets to assure public access and safety. I talked to several people in local government who all said that the Lake Oswego had its hands tied because of the state law and the compliance requirements. While I recognize the state mandate, I believe that the legislation was short-sighted in considering implications for public safety in areas such as First Edition. I researched past rulings, and in particular, LeGrand versus Astoria, and I would ask that Lake Oswego take a measured, detailed look at the local safety implications, because local public safety is the responsibility of the city, not the state. In the face of aggressive legislation, I believe that we feel like we should be working together in cooperation with the city to further examine the fundamental charter and legal foundation for your decisions on parking with regard to public safety, along with innovative structural answers to the problem. For the immediate problems at hand, I know that there's pre-application consultation with neighborhood associations prior to the application being filed, where the developer receives important community input about their pre-proposal. I think this model allows room for an open discussion of parking and a meaningful dialogue about the impacts to that neighborhood and public safety. While thinking when legislation was written was that the lender was going to provide and require parking, I suspect that many of these developments will be privately equity funded. I am wondering instead if there's room for some early collaboration on parking concerns that result in satisfactory good neighbor solutions for both the developer and the affected neighbors and the neighborhood association. While considering the fundamental legal responsibilities for public safety, I would like the Planning Commission to consider a process change that specifically encourages this type of good neighbor solution based on a robust and meaningful early dialogue to address public safety and parking concerns early in the spirit of cooperation. I appreciate the offer to say something tonight about this, and it's clear that there's been a lot of thought and work that's been put into it by staff and the commission, and that's very much appreciated.
Thank you so much for your time. Christina, is there anyone else signed up to
That's all
testify?
I have for.
Yep. I think I'm supposed to ask the audience if anyone else would like to testify. Okay. Okay, the public hearing is now closed, and the Planning Commission will begin its deliberations. No public comment is permitted during it. Any comments, thoughts, questions, commissioners?
My personal notes are related to what we discussed earlier about the large, the over half-acre parking lots. I know we brought all the options out today, so we could, examine those, see if, the public had any opinions on them. Well, personally, I am, most in favor of, just keeping the trees as an option. I think at least the solar panels have a local impact, support a local energy grid. But really, I think the option of paying into the, the DOE fund, something like a renewable energy fund, I don't think, doesn't, impact Lake Oswego necessarily in any way. And it just seems like a sort of, pay to play, just, okay, pay the fine essentially and, move on with, the big nasty parking lot that's gonna, be a big heat island and whatever. So I would personally be in favor of removing that as an option. And I think keeping the other two would be agreeable.
Removing the pay to the DOE, that fund.
Yep. That's what I would propose. And just to note that it's in the supplemental staff memo, that part of it is on page 35.
A quick clarification, though, I would just point out that regardless of the climate mitigation action chosen, so regardless of it's the payment in lieu, regardless of it's the tree canopy requirement or with 40% tree canopy requirement or the solar panel requirement, there is a baseline requirement to provide 30% tree canopy as well as trees along driveways. So there's really, very limited possibility that we could still have these huge sort of heat-producing parking lots. It's a difference between like 30 and 40% that we're talking about here. So I'm not sure that that's a likely outcome.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Commissioners, any other comments, thoughts, questions, deliberations? I think I think what we're tasked with is deliberating and then deciding, do we want to, does anyone want to make a motion to approve the proposed code amendments as they're drafted? Option B, approve them as drafted with slight revisions, which, for example, Commissioner Rigby's, or the option 3 is, I guess, to reject them. Make sure I say that correctly. Disagree with the findings of the report, and then recommend to the city council not to approve the proposal. So just keep in back of mind, that's what we're trying to get to.
I had one question which came up from public comments from you, is have there been any, we'll call it this safety overview of what she has brought up with respect to street congestion and in the need of a fire truck to get through? Maybe I missed it, but I don't recall seeing that. So can you give an update on that?
During the permitting process, all the developments are reviewed by the fire marshal, engineering department, the planning department, building. All of these departments review that for compliance with city regulations. With regard to safety in terms of parking within the public right-of-way, parking in the right-of-way is under the purview of the city engineer. And so if there is a safety concern, the city engineer always has the purview to, for instance, restrict parking to one side of the street, no parking. In terms of a paid parking or parking permit program, that's not something that we currently have in that area of First Edition. But if it became an issue, at this point we don't know if it will become an issue, but if it became an issue, that's certainly something the city could consider at that time. But there is no requirement for these particular developments that were cited for there to be an on-site paid parking program or any particular public safety issue that's identified at this time. Again, anyone can call in, report issues. If people are parking illegally, of course, we have our police who can enforce that. But if it becomes kind of a repetitive problem, then our city engineer does have tools to assure adequate emergency vehicle access.
Right, and we're really talking about using the right-of-way for parking right now. So the right-of-way exists. There is, ostensibly, you can be parking in that area now, regardless of the development. The development could increase that pressure. But, I think generally speaking, our policy is to allow parking within the rights-of-way in these types of areas. And, obviously, we would not be approving anything that we thought had, potential to introduce unsafe sort of emergency access or other types of requirements. That's all something that's reviewed by the fire marshal again and the city engineer to ensure that there is that adequate access for development.
And as the commenter mentioned, Not all cottage clusters require a pre-application conference, but if they're proposing a middle housing land division, they do. And during that process, obviously, we would encourage neighborhood dialogue and input, and there are many builders and developers that are receptive to that. I don't know if potentially the neighborhood input had any influence on why one of the cottage clusters is providing parking versus one that isn't. I'm not sure. As far as the city, we can certainly encourage that dialogue. We cannot require them to provide parking. And in fact, as you know, the Housing and Accountability and Production Office will be operative on July 1st, and that is where folks can report cities who are not complying with housing laws. And we are not allowed to require parking for those, for single family, or actually any within a certain distance of line 35. So the city couldn't require that. But we absolutely encourage neighborhood folks, and the city would be happy to help facilitate that discussion if they wanted to negotiate and voluntarily provide parking.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I just also point out that the first edition area is an area where we have already exempted, or we've already, sort of not been implementing minimum parking requirements since early 2023. So this is, something where we're talking about Phase B that was sort of enacted in Phase A. Phase B doesn't introduce anything new to that area, but there's nothing that would be changed. It would continue to be no parking, minimum requirement in that area. So really, none of the options for Phase B would change the fact that that area is covered under, all of the different options for CFAC, regardless of what we might decide. So first edition is definitely one of those areas where the state is very firm that we have to remove minimum parking requirements. And we already have, effectively.
Commissioner Rigby?
Do we have any further discussion of options? Because, if there aren't any other proposed changes, I would move forward with a motion to, to recommend these changes with the alteration that I noted.
Okay, we have a motion to tentatively approve the proposal and direct staff to report findings, conclusions, and orders with the slight revision to remove that third option on the, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head, but remove the third option on compliance with parking surface by, I think it's putting money into a fund.
I guess my only question is that, the suggestion that you have, I understand where it's going. And we had kind of touched on it in previous meetings when we discussed this, that, well, the funds just goes into a general account that might not even be available for us. It could go to another area, right? So the goal is to try and keep resources here as opposed to spreading them out if you're going to have some kind of a fee to do that. Is it correct? Did I interpret that correctly?
I'm not sure that there was a consensus necessarily that said that, but I think what we had responded with is that, these climate impacts they don't operate on a citywide scale. They don't operate on even a region-wide scale. They operate on a global scale, and any change that we can make, even within the state of Oregon, has a tangible impact on the city of Lake Oswego. And I think that's why this is how we responded to these concerns in the past, by saying that, these aren't city-specific. It's not like our, GHG emissions are limited just to the city of Lake Oswego. These things spread through the air and go all over. So we, just taking that into account, we recognize that even green energy investments elsewhere in the city would have a positive impact on Lake Oswego and other places too.
But you are correct. I think when the DLCD guidance they provided, they said that any funds that went in there, they do not guarantee that it's going to be used in the jurisdiction from which they came.
That's kind of what I thought. Okay. So, and you were right with what you're saying. So I would second the motion.
Okay, we have a second. Christina, can you take a roll call on the motion?
Mitchell?
I'll vote no. I think we should be adopting and proposing it tentatively as written without the revision that Commissioner Rigby has stated.
Rigby?
Yes.
Scanoni?
Yes.
Bly?
I would vote no for the same reason. I think it should have approved as written.
I think this is the first tie I've ever seen, to be honest.
Well, so the motion fails, and so another motion is invited to be made.
So I make a motion to approve the findings as written and send them to the council.
Am I allowed to second? Is Chair allowed to second? Yeah, I second. Christina, please take a roll call.
Mitchell,
Yes.
Rigby,
No.
Pinoni,
No.
Sly,
Yes.
All right, that motion fails as well. So the commission's options, we have to have a motion to recommend or not recommend. However, I would point out, so we can continue the matter to the next meeting. That might be necessary in order to pick up a fifth vote, okay, fifth or sixth vote. Obviously, this is a matter of split opinion by the commission, and however you decide it, that would be carried forward in the minutes to the city council, and they'll take additional testimony on that side, and they'll vote. So I guess what I'm saying is you've got a major statement. The only question is whether it goes with a recommendation to exclude it or include it and then some commentary to try to take that out, the exclusion, take it out. So you can decide what you want to do, maybe another vote tonight, or recognizing that that sentiment's going to go to the commission. We're going to draft up findings, so, or you'll have to wait for next meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Boone. Yeah, I have a question. If it's taken to the city council, if we approve something and it's taken to the city council, is it going to be highlighted to the city council that there was like, that we just disagreed on this one
Yeah,
minor
I think
point?
staff would note that, and the staff in the council
The
report. that would
findings
go
in the
up.
council report, yeah.
The findings are the vote of the commission, the majority of the commission. So I don't know that it's appropriate to put in the findings to have a pro and con, that's not a debate.
Sure.
But certainly, the council report can note the divided opinion of the commission.
And it would be in the minutes rather, not the findings.
Right, so, I mean, from my perspective, I think we agree with 99% of what's in front of us, and we want to have a recommendation go to city council. So I think I would think we'd want to agree on something. Whether it's with that revision or without that revision, to me, it's almost immaterial because city council is going to make their decision anyway. And as long as they're aware of, like, we made a recommendation with the slight revision, they get to decide it. So, that said, I would, if we want to do it with revision, I'm happy to do it with revision, with noted the objections, or if we're happy to do it the reverse, then I think everyone is really getting their say. So, what do y'all think?
I agree. I don't think we should continue this over this one line item. And yep, there'll be findings.
Yeah. So can we have a motion?
Well, I'll move to I'll move to recommend these changes with the excision of subsection B on the climate mitigation action.
Do we have a second?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Okay. Christina, can you take the roll call?
Mitchell,
Yes, with my previously noted objections to it, but yes.
Rigby,
Yes.
Pinoni,
Yes.
Sly,
Yes.
This is a tentative decision, preliminary decision of the commission's recommendation. The final decision on the recommendation will be made upon adoption of the written order at the next meeting, which is November the 13th, Wednesday, November 13th, due to Veterans Day holiday. And then that recommendation will be forwarded to the city council for review. And I would note that the commissioners who are not here tonight are eligible to vote on the matter at the next meeting for the adoption of findings. So we'll see if we remain at 4-0 with that revision or what happens.
Thank you, Mr. Boone. And with that, I believe that concludes the item number 7 on the agenda, which will take us to 8, other business. Mr. Olson?
No other business from me.
Okay. Item 9, schedule review.
All right, I will just give you a quick overview of the schedule through the end of the year. As Deputy City Attorney Boone mentioned, we are going to reconvene on Wednesday, November 13th. I say 13th, and I just say things that start with TH, apparently. So on Wednesday, November 13th, we will be looking at the findings for tonight's hearing. We'll also be having a work session, the first work session on the 2024-2025 annual code amendments. So that package will be discussed by Evan Franstead, Senior Planner with the Specialty in Development Review. And we will also receive an update on the city's electric vehicle charging strategy from Amanda Watson in the City Manager's Office. We are canceling the November 25th meeting for a lack of agenda items, as well as it's a terrible time to do a tour or something out in the field because it's going to be dark before we even start. So I was thinking about it, Commissioner Scanoni, but it's gonna have to be a different time. Also, that's the Monday before Thanksgiving, so it just seemed like a good date to cross off here. But we will be getting back together before the end of the year on December 9th to discuss, basically for the second time, hold another work session on the annual code amendments. And that's basically all we have scheduled for that meeting on the 9th right now. So yeah, that takes us through the end of the year. You'll see, obviously, starting next year, we're going to start talking about, council goals. There will be a, boards and commissions summit, and then we'll talk about work plans and things like that. So that's kind of on the horizon for early 2025.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Olson. And I think unless anyone else has comments, we're adjourned.